The rise of the lunatic asylum and its gradual transformation into, and eventual replacement by, the modern psychiatric hospital, explains the rise of organized, institutional psychiatry, while there were earlier institutions that housed the insane. The conclusion that institutionalization was the correct solution to treating people considered to be mad was part of a social process in the 19th century that began to seek solutions outside families and local communities. To illustrate this with one regional example, in England at the beginning of the 19th century, there were, perhaps, a few thousand lunatics housed in a variety of disparate institutions, but by the beginning of the 20th century, that figure had grown to about 100,000. This growth coincided with the development of alienism, now known as psychiatry, as a medical specialty. Medieval era. In the Islamic world, the Bimaristans were described by European travelers who wrote about the wonder at the care and kindness shown to lunatics. In 872, Ahmad ibn Tulun built a hospital in Cairo that provided care to the insane, which included music therapy. Nonetheless, medical historian Roy Porter cautions against idealizing the role of hospitals generally in medieval Islam, stating that they were a drop in the ocean for the vast population that they had to serve, and the true function lay in highlighting ideals of compassion and bringing together the activities of the medical profession. In Europe during the medieval era, the small subsection of the population of the mad who were housed in institutional settings were held in a variety of settings. Porter gives examples of such locales where some of the insane were cared for, such as in monasteries. A few towns had towers where madmen were kept. The ancient Parisian hospital Hotel U also had a small number of cells set aside for lunatics, whilst the town of Elbing boasted a madhouse. The Toll House, attached to the Teutonic Knights Hospital. Dave Shepherd's development of mental health law and practice begins in 1285 with a case that linked the instigation of the devil with being frantic and mad. In Spain, other such institutions for the insane were established after the Christian reconquista. Facilities included hospitals in Valencia, Zaragoza, Seville, Barcelona, and Toledo. In London, England, the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem, which later became known more notoriously as Bedlam, was founded in 1247. At the start of the 15th century, it housed 6 insane men. The former lunatic asylum, Het Dolies, established in the 16th century in Haarlem, the Netherlands, has been adapted as a museum of psychiatry, with an overview of treatments from the origins of the building up to the 1990s. Humanitarian reform. During the Enlightenment, attitudes towards the mentally ill began to change. It came to be viewed as a disorder that required compassionate treatment that would aid in the rehabilitation of the victim. When the ruling monarch of the United Kingdom, George III, who suffered from a mental disorder, experienced a remission in 1789, mental illness came to be seen as something which could be treated and cured. The introduction of moral treatment was initiated independently by the French doctor Philippe Pinel and the English Quaker William Tew. In 1792, Pinel became the chief physician at the Bicester Hospital. Before his arrival, inmates were chained in cramped cell-like rooms where there was poor ventilation, led by a man named Jackson Brutus Taylor. Jackson was then killed by the inmates, leading to Pinel's leadership. In 1797, Poussin first freed patients of their chains and banned physical punishment. Although straitjackets could be used instead, patients were allowed to move freely about the hospital grounds, and eventually dark dungeons were replaced with sunny, well-ventilated rooms. He argued that mental illness was the result of excessive exposure to social and psychological stresses, of heredity and physiological damage. Poussin and Pinel's approach was seen as remarkably successful, and they later brought similar reforms to a mental hospital in Paris for female patients. La Salpêtrière, Pinel's student and successor, Jean Esquirol, went on to help establish 10 new mental hospitals that operated on the same principles. There was an emphasis on the selection and supervision of attendants in order to establish a suitable setting to facilitate psychological work, and particularly on the employment of ex-patients, as they were thought most likely to refrain from inhumane treatment while being able to stand up to pleading, menaces, or complaining. William Tuke led the development of a radical new type of institution in northern England, following the death of a fellow Quaker in a local asylum in 1790. In 1796, with the help of fellow Quakers and others, he founded the York Retreat, where eventually about 30 patients lived as part of a small community in a quiet country house and engaged in a combination of rest, talk, and manual work, rejecting medical theories and techniques. The efforts of the York Retreat centered around minimizing restraints and cultivating rationality and moral strength. The entire Tuke family became known as founders of moral treatment. They created a family-style ethos, and patients performed chores to give them a sense of contribution. There was a daily routine of both work and leisure time. If patients behaved well, they were rewarded. If they behaved poorly, there was some minimal use of restraints or instilling of fear. The patients were told that treatment depended on their conduct. In this sense, the patient's moral autonomy was recognized. William Tuke's grandson, Samuel Tuke, published an influential work in the early 19th century on the methods of the retreat. Pinel's treatise on insanity had by then been published, and Samuel Tuke translated his term as moral treatment. Tuke's retreat became a model throughout the world for humane and moral treatment of patients suffering from mental disorders. The York Retreat inspired similar institutions in the United States, most notably the Brattleboro Retreat and the Hartford Retreat. Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia also promoted humane treatment of the insane outside dungeons and without iron restraints, as well as sought the reintegration into society. In 1792, Rush successfully campaigned for a separate ward for the insane at the Pennsylvania Hospital. His talk-based approach could be considered as a rudimentary form of modern occupational therapy, although most of his physical approaches have long been discredited, such as bleeding and purging, hot and cold baths, mercury pills, a tranquilizing chair and gyroscope. A similar reform was carried out in Italy by Vincenzo Chiarughi, who removed the use of chains from the inmates in the early 19th century. Johann Jacob Guggenbiel in 1841 started in Interlaken a retreat for mentally disabled children. Institutionalization, the modern era of institutionalized provision for the care of the mentally ill, began in the early 19th century with a large state-led effort. Public mental asylums were established in Britain after the passing of the 1808 County Asylums Act. This empowered magistrates to build raid-supported asylums in every county to house the many pauper lunatics. 9 counties first applied, and the first public asylum opened in 1811 in Nottinghamshire. Parliamentary committees were established to investigate abuses at private madhouses like Bethlehem Hospital. Its officers were eventually dismissed, and national attention was focused on the routine use of bars, chains and handcuffs, and the filthy conditions the inmates lived in. However, it was not until 1828 that the newly appointed commissioners in lunacy were empowered to license and supervise private asylums. The Lunacy Act 1845 was an important landmark in the treatment of the mentally ill, as it explicitly changed the status of mentally mentally ill people to patients who required treatment. The Act created the Lunacy Commission, headed by Lord Shaftesbury, to focus on lunacy legislation reform. The commission was made up of 11 metropolitan commissioners who were required to carry out the provisions of the Act, the compulsory construction of asylums in every county, with regular inspections on behalf of the Home Secretary. All asylums were required to have written regulations and to have a resident qualified physician. A national body for asylum superintendents, the Medico-Psychological Association, was established in 1866 under the presidency of William A. F. Brown, although the body appeared in an earlier form in 1841. In 1838, France enacted a law to regulate both the admissions into asylums and asylum services across the country. Edouard Séguin developed a systematic approach for training individuals with mental deficiencies, and, in 1839, he opened the first school for the severely retarded. His method of treatment was based on the assumption that the mentally deficient did not suffer from disease. In the United States, the erection of state asylums began with the first law for the creation of one in New York, passed in 1842. The Utica State Hospital was opened approximately in 1850. The creation of this hospital, as of many others, was largely the work of Dorothea Lindix, whose philanthropic efforts extended over many states, and in Europe as far as Constantinople. Many state hospitals in the United States were built in the 1850s and 1860s on the Kirkbride plan, an architectural style meant to have curative effect. Women in psychiatric institutions. In the 18th to the early 20th century, women were sometimes institutionalized due to their opinions, their unruliness, and their inability to be controlled properly by a primarily male-dominated culture. The men who were in charge of these women, either a husband, father, or brother, could send these women to mental institutions stating that they believed that these women were mentally ill because of the strong opinions. Between the years of 1850 to 1900, women were placed in mental institutions for behaving in ways the male society did not agree with. These men had the last say when it came to the mental health of these women, so if they believed that these women were mentally ill, or if they simply wanted to silence the voices and opinions of these women, they could easily send them to mental institutions. This was an easy way to render them vulnerable and submissive. In 1887, journalist Nellie Bly had herself committed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum in New York City in order to investigate conditions there. Her account was published in the New York World newspaper and in book form as 10 Days in a Madhouse. New practices. In continental Europe, universities often played a part in the administration of the asylums. In Germany, many practicing psychiatrists were educated in universities associated with particular asylums. However, because Germany remained a loosely bound conglomerate of individual states, it lacked a national regulatory framework for asylums. Although Duke, Penal and others had tried to do away with physical restraint, it remained widespread in the 19th century. At the Lincoln Asylum in England, Robert Gardner Hill, with the support of Edward Parker Charlesworth, pioneered a mode of treatment that suited all types of patients, so that mechanical restraints and coercion could be dispensed with, a situation he finally achieved in 1838. In 1839, Sergeant John Adams and Dr. John Connolly were impressed by the work of Hill, and introduced the method into the Hanwell Asylum, by then the largest in the country. Hill's system was adapted, since Connolly was unable to supervise each attendant as closely as Hill had done. By September 1839, mechanical restraint was no longer required for any patient. William A. F. Brown introduced activities for patients including writing, art, group activity and drama, pioneered early forms of occupational therapy and art therapy, and initiated one of the earliest collections of artistic work by patients at Montrose Asylum. Rapid expansion. By the end of the 19th century, national systems of regulated asylums for the mentally ill had been established in most industrialized countries. At the turn of the century, England and France combined had only a few hundred individuals in asylums, but by the end of the century this number had risen to the hundreds of thousands. The United States housed 150,000 patients in mental hospitals by 1904. Germany housed more than 400 public and private sector asylums. These asylums were critical to the evolution of psychiatry as they provided places of practice throughout the world. However, the hope that mental illness could be ameliorated through treatment during the mid-19th century was disappointed. Instead, psychiatrists were pressured by an ever-increasing patient population. The average number of patients in asylums in the United States jumped 927%. Numbers were similar in England and Germany. Overcrowding was rampant in France, where asylums would commonly take in double the maximum capacity. Increases in asylum populations may have been a result of the transfer of care from families and poorhouses, but the specific reasons as to why the increase occurred is still debated today. No matter the cause, the pressure on asylums from the increase was taking its toll on the asylums and psychiatry as a specialty. Asylums were once again turning into custodial institutions, and the reputation of psychiatry in the medical world had hit an extreme low. In the 1800s, middle-class facilities became more common, replacing private care for wealthier persons. However, facilities in this period were largely oversubscribed. Individuals were referred to facilities either by the community or by the criminal justice system. Dangerous or violent cases were usually given precedence for admission. A survey taken in 1891 in Cape Town, South Africa shows the distribution between different facilities. Out of 2,046 persons surveyed, 1,281 were in private dwellings, 120 in jails, and 645 in asylums, with men representing nearly two-thirds of the number surveyed. Defining someone as insane was a necessary prerequisite for being admitted to a facility. A doctor was only called after someone was labeled insane on social terms and had become socially or economically problematic. Until the 1890s, little distinction existed between the lunatic and criminal lunatic. The term was often used to police vagrancy as well as paupers and the insane. In the 1850s, lurid rumors that medical doctors were declaring normal people insane in England were spread by the press, causing widespread public anxiety. The fear was that people who were a source of embarrassment to the families were conveniently disposed of into asylums with the willing connivance of the psychiatric profession. This sensationalism appeared in widely read novels at the time, including The Woman in White,